Thank you so much for joining us today at our last session of Bloomberg Green, The Time Is Now. My name is Emily Chasan. I'm the Sustainable Finance Editor at Bloomberg Green, and I'm delighted to be joined today by former U.S. Vice President Al Gore, who's also the Chairman of Generation Investment Management. Bloomberg Green has been a huge initiative for us this year here at Bloomberg, a huge change in climate journalism to have a climate change magazine. A lot of people don't know about you that you started off as a journalist yourself. I'm curious, with your years of experience in the climate crisis, how is climate journalism playing a role now?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. But first of all, Emily, let me say congratulations on Bloomberg Green to you and all of your colleagues. It's an extremely important launch, and I'm going to be a regular reader. You can count on that. And luckily, I think more and more people are searching out the kind of news that you are providing. Yeah, I was a reporter for 5 years. When I came back from the Army in Vietnam, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I got offered a job, $95 a week. It's hard to imagine that kind of salary these days, for me anyway. But I had a fantastic mentor, John Sigenthaler, who was editor of the Nashville Tennessean at that time. Really a legendary guy, and I loved journalism. I did all kinds, and in any case, I've maybe paid a little more careful attention to the emergence of climate journalism than I might have otherwise, except for those 5 years of experience as a young cub reporter, you might say. And I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts. One of my classmates when I was an undergraduate went on to become dean of Yale Law School, Robert Post, a very smart guy. And he had a phrase recently. He said that we're witnessing an attack on the authority of knowledge. And I love that phrase. I wrote a book back in '07 called The Assault on Reason, and covered some of the same themes. One thing that has been a problem, or was a problem for a while, is what's referred to as both sidesism. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about Bloomberg Green is that it is a significant step in the creation of a core body of expertise, so that the journalists who are dedicated to this don't have to rely on lazy formulae like both sidesism. You know, it is a complicated subject, of course, as you know extremely well. And so an easy shortcut in the past was, well, so-and-so says this, but then so-and-so over here says the opposite, and we don't know, you figure it out. I think we're coming out of that for the most part. One other thought, I've written in the past that the free press is supposed to function as a kind of immune system for democracy. And not to torture the metaphor, but there has been kind of an autoimmune disease with attacks on the free press, with the phrase fake news and similar phrases intended to undermine the authority of knowledge. And just recently, this movement of reporting data about the pandemic away from the Centers of Disease Control toward political appointees, that I think that should have created maybe a little bit more of an uproar than it did. But overall, I think that the climate journalists of today led to the resignation of Scott Pruitt and Ryan Zinke, and the quick discovery of a lot of these attempted rollbacks of climate and environmental laws. So I think that we're seeing the start of a golden era for climate journalism, and I think this launch is very much a part of it.
That's great to hear. You know, it's so interesting to think about how this space has evolved. I'm a sustainable finance editor at Bloomberg. I've been following from the sort of the infancy of data and information in the space to today. Just this past week, you guys announced this new climate trace initiative, and to really have to fill in the gaps, right, with this information that's really been incomplete. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. It's going back to our journalism theme. It's sort of this trust but verify idea, as a lot of the companies just sort of report this information.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about it. We had the launch of this new climate trace initiative on Wednesday, kind of a soft launch because it's a work in progress, but we have enough validation now to have a very high degree of confidence that it is going to work. A guy named Gavin McCormick is the CEO of a company called Wattime, and he is he's the head of one of 9 tech firms and organizations that I've partnered with for 13 months now. And the key technology breakthrough is in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what this now makes possible is to crunch the numbers from dozens of different streams of data to derive an accurate emissions number for every significant man-made greenhouse gas emissions on the entire planet. That sounds like a very ambitious goal, but it's now possible to do with multiple existing satellite systems, ground-based sensors, sea-based sensors. In some geographies, we'll be able to fly drones to fine-tune the algorithms and perfect them. Just since the announcement on Wednesday, we've had a huge number of new organizations reaching out to us to offer their data and some their AI expertise, which may also be helpful. We've got a good core of experts there, but I think that it's extremely exciting because there's been no actionable data on the emissions. To draw a quick analogy, in contacted tracing for COVID-19, if the positive test is 2 weeks old before they start trying to trace the contacts, it's useless. You can't really do anything effective with it. Similarly, the emissions data is usually a year old or 6 months old. It's self-reported. It's not considered as accurate as it should be. Back before the Paris conference, China suddenly fessed up that their emissions were 17% higher than the world had thought. Good that they disclosed it. I appreciate Xi Jinping, their lead guy, then doing that. But within about 6 months, we will have a hard launch, and by next June, we will have our first comprehensive report of every significant source of emissions, who's responsible for what, when, how much, at what rates, and then the data will be updated every 6 hours. This data will be actionable. It will be actionable for governments, some of whom don't really have good data on what emissions are coming in their territory, and many of whom really want that data and want to be able to act on it. There are a lot of companies who want to be able to verify what they're pledging to do, and others who want to not have to worry that competitors will cut corners and steal a march somehow. There are lots of NGOs and activist groups who want to know who's doing what, and Generation Investment Management is already leading the formation of an investor coalition to make the data actionable in markets and in the investment space, so that pensions and asset managers who want to respond to their clients' demands that they invest more in solutions to the climate crisis and divest from bad actors that are making it worse will have a much more accurate, well, for the first time, really have an accurate indication of who's doing what. So we're very excited about it. It's kind of a massively distributed body cam for the Earth. We will be able to provide very accurate, very timely information.
It's really interesting because there's been a lot more real-time focus on emissions in this COVID-19 era when everything sort of stopped and you could sort of see the nitrous oxide leave the cities and to see the pollution disappear. And I think you've been saying it's almost hard to see the emissions in the sky, right? You can't see what we're doing. It's just an open sewer. So how do you think this can change things going forward?
I think it can and will create an entirely new reality. Uh, CO2 is invisible, tasteless, and odorless, and so it's been very hard to track. Methane is somewhat easier to track when you have the instruments built for it. There are some satellites now that can do spot reporting, and they don't have the periodicity of coverage, but that will come as well. But as I said, we're going to blend together and crunch the numbers of dozens of different data streams that will. Let me give you one example. One of our coalition members was set up to track illegal fishing in all the oceans of the world. And they realized that the instruments and the data collection resources they have make it possible for them to track the CO2 emissions of the ships that they're following and all the ships they come in contact with. So they're part of that coalition. And so, well, let me use an example from the Black Lives Matter movement. After the horrendous murder of George Floyd, somebody asked in the media, are these kinds of horrible incidents becoming more common? And the answer was, no, they're just on videotape for the first time. And that has changed a lot. And now one of these incidents occurs. It's not all that uncommon to have 4 or 5 different iPhone bystander videos and security cam footage from the nearby buildings and the body cam footage after a delay from the police. You put it all together as almost a mini documentary 48 hours after the tragedy. And sometimes police officers are properly exonerated. But more often, tragically, it reveals for all of us the tragedy that has gone ignored and unprotested for so long. And now it's kind of thrilling in a way to have these mass marches where the vast majority of the people are white, opening their minds and hearts for the first time to actually realize what's been going on. And I think the same kind of awakening is going to follow with the full disclosure of constant streams of accurate data on why the climate crisis is getting worse, where the causes are coming from, who is responsible. And you're going to see that data made actionable immediately.
Yeah, I guess that's a really interesting view of the future and where this could go. And I guess real-time information, as we've seen at Bloomberg for a long time, is so important in helping people make decisions about their lives. I wanted to ask about COVID a little bit. The past few months have been probably not what anybody expected for 2020. And at Generation, you guys have one of the oldest sustainable investment shops with over about 20 billion under management. And you've been sort of looking out at this sustainability future and road mapping it for years. So now that COVID has hit, is it an accelerant to some of those trends that you've been seeing, or is it a distraction?
We think the evidence is now very clear that it's actually accelerating the sustainability revolution and accelerating the transition to renewable energy, electric mobility, the retrofitting of buildings to save money. It pays for itself. Lots of businesses and industries are really trying to move very quickly. And I think the pandemic has actually accelerated this. Last week, Generation released our 4th annual Sustainability Trends Report. And thank you, by the way, for Bloomberg covering that. Thank you. And one of our findings was that this is definitely accelerating this transition. We think the world is in the early stages of what we call the sustainability revolution, which is based on new digital tools like artificial intelligence and machine learning that we're using in Climate Trace. By the way, TRACE stands for Tracking Real-Time Atmospheric Carbon Emissions. And it's giving a lot of executive teams the ability to manipulate and manage protons and electrons and atoms and molecules and genes, and with the same precision that the IT companies have long demonstrated in managing bits of information. And we think it has the magnitude of the industrial revolution coupled with the speed of the digital revolution. And there's so many examples. And the pandemic, as horrible as it is, has stimulated, as some tragedies in history do, a new way of thinking, a new awakening, if you will. And by the way, the overlay between the pandemic and the climate crisis is also capturing a lot of attention. We see now that the burning of fossil fuels is a precondition for higher death rates and higher infection rates from COVID-19. China completed a massive study of 324 cities that correlated precisely the amount of carbon fuel related air pollution city by city and the infection rate from COVID-19, the seriousness of the cases and the death rate. Harvard School of Public Health published a study earlier this year showing the same linear correlation in US cities. And 18 months ago, there was a very big study going back to look at the flu pandemic of 1918-19 and matching it with the amount of coal burning in American cities. And it correlated precisely with a 10% increased mortality rate from that flu, with even a moderate increase in the pollution from burning coal and an 11% increase in infant mortality. So, you know, there are two similarities between the pandemic and the climate crisis. One is both show us that when the scientists are setting their hair on fire, so to speak, and trying to warn us in ways that'll get our attention, it's best not to ignore them. The best epidemiologists and virologists have been warning us of a pandemic almost exactly like the one we're now struggling to conquer. And the climate scientists, of course, for even longer have been trying to warn us of what the science is telling us about this existential threat to the future of human civilization. The other similarity, Emily, is that both of them have revealed in stark relief the pre-existing injustices and inequalities suffered by Black Americans and other communities of color, indigenous peoples, Latinx peoples. The highest infection rate from COVID-19 is in the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona. And the death rate and infection rate for Black Americans is so much higher. It is just horrific that the majority of Americans, and I include myself in this indictment, have been so long unaware to an actionable degree of what this means. The net worth of the average Black family and the average white family compare as follows. It takes 11 and a half Black families to match the net worth of one white family. And that hasn't changed in 50 years. It's horrific. So I think that, and I think these overlapping awakenings, that's a clunky phrase, but I think that's what we're equipped with here, are actually supporting one another. The LGBTQ gains, which came earlier, are being consolidated. The recent Supreme Court decision proves it. The gender equity gains of the last few years are being consolidated. They're not going away. And the awakening about the dire need and the urgency of addressing the inequality, less access to healthcare, less access to Zoomable jobs, to good housing, et cetera, for communities of color, that has to be addressed now. And people are determined to make these concerns the heart of the movement to build back better, to have a so-called Great Reset.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you've been talking about this idea of sustainable capitalism for a long time. Is that more a thing now than it was before? Where are you in the journey, do you think, of getting towards sustainable capitalism?
Well, yes, thank you for asking. Yes, Generation was founded 16 years ago. We've been managing assets for 15 years. And during that time, there have been some dramatic changes. First of all, there has been voluminous academic research now proving that in almost every sector of the global economy, those businesses fully integrating ESG factors into their business plans are more profitable than their peers that do not. And when it's done correctly, asset managers fully integrating ESG are getting better returns. I'm knocking on wood there because we play a role in that, but it's across the board. And so one old accusation against managers using ESG has now been turned on its head. You used to hear some other managers saying, well, if you use ESG, you may be violating your fiduciary responsibility to your clients. Well, now that the evidence shows clearly it's best practice, those managers and pension funds that do not fully integrate ESG are at very high risk of violating their fiduciary responsibility because they're leaving money on the table if for some misguided ideological legacy bias, they say, oh, we're not going to deal with that. They're not doing the kind of job for their clients that now equals best practice. And of course, the other changes have come partly because there's a growing awareness of how serious this crisis is and how we all have to reorganize our operations and the design of our civilization, really. And the good news is, of course, the cost of renewable electricity, electric vehicles, batteries, retrofits, regenerative agriculture, circular manufacturing, forestry and ocean management, all of these things have been getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're now so competitive that last year, for example, if you look at all of the new electricity generation capacity installed worldwide, 80% of it was renewable. We're seeing the validation of the wisdom articulated by one of the Saudi oil ministers decades ago when he told the king, you better remember the Stone Age didn't end because of a shortage of stones. It ended because something better came along, and something better's come along now. And the sustainability revolution is bringing that new reality into every sector of the global economy.
That is such a good point, that especially looking at all these sort of exogenous shocks that we've had into the market and into finance the past few months, that this has really revealed quite a bit about what underpins capitalism and what the future could look like. I wanted to ask you just to wrap up a little bit about policy. There's a lot of really interesting government policy coming out around the world, in Europe and the US, on climate right now, on green stimulus. What do you think really needs to happen there, and what's going to make a difference, and what are you seeing that is inspiring you about the future and policy?
Well, I'm quite encouraged that in many countries, the so-called recovery plans are now being shaped as green recovery plans. This is partly because we have crossed a threshold beyond which it's ever clearer that the sustainability technologies, like the ones I mentioned a moment ago, are cheaper and better, and they don't have the co-pollution like so-called conventional air pollution, mostly from burning fossil fuels, that kills 9 million people a year, even before you factor in these elevated death rates from COVID-19 that comes to people that breathe in more pollution. I don't want to get into any of the political dialogues that are also woven into this, Emily, but one of the leading candidates for president just put out a climate plan that I think is pretty impressive, and most people who share my opinions agree with that, and I think there will be a clear contrast on the ballot in the U.S. In the European Union, the recovery plan there is very green. Now, China, we're going to have to wait and see because they're the first economy to come back after the pandemic to the extent that they have, and emissions, as predicted, have gone back up again. But I'm hopeful that overall the world economy is going to make this recovery a green recovery and a jobs-intensive recovery. And that's another reason why this is being done. The Oxford study that Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern, who spoke on your program, and others just put out, shows that for each dollar or euro spent in a recovery, there are 3 times as many jobs created if it's a green investment. Here in the U.S., for the last 5 years, solar installer has been by far the fastest growing job, 5 times faster job growth than average job growth. Second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. We have to have a just transition. We have to make sure that coal miners, for example, who it's not their fault that the climate crisis emerged. We owe them gratitude for what they have done for so long to help build up the civilization we have. They deserve better jobs with good pay, and there are many other examples. But I'm encouraged that we're going to see a green recovery.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Al. It was great to hear your thoughts, wide-ranging, and to sort of unpack that speed of the digital transition and the sustainability revolution that you're seeing. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us at Bloomberg Green today.
Thank you for inviting me, Emily, and to you and all your colleagues. Once again, congratulations on the launch of Bloomberg Green. I'm very excited about it.